Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Heal with Kat podcast. My name is Kat and I am your host. And if you're new here, welcome. And if you are coming back again for another episode, welcome back. As I mentioned, my name is Kat. If you're new here, I'm a Family Constellation Therapy facilitator. What a mouthful. For the episode today, I'll be referring to my work as FCT. It's like the easiest way for me to refer to it. And yeah, I'm really excited for this episode this week because honestly, I've talked about this topic many different times on social media, but I've never spoken about it in the realm of a podcast. And I've recorded this actually once already and I wasn't happy with it. So I re-recorded it because as I was moving through the process of recording the episode, I felt that there was so much missing. There was this kind of spiritual element about death that I was really missing in the episode that I'll touch on a little bit today. And I'll recommend a great book for those of you who are uncomfortable with the idea of death. I imagine if you're listening to this podcast episode, you're not too uncomfortable with it, given the fact that you're listening to a podcast about early death. But it's not going to get too traumatic. It really today is going to be about what happens in our family system when somebody dies early, meaning somebody that dies under 55 years old. So we'll get into all of that. But if you're familiar with the podcast, I usually do a just mini life update at the beginning of the episodes. And I've really been taking you guys along my journey of my gut issues, just as a little reminder of why this share even started in the first place about a month and a half ago. I got really, really bad period pains and I fainted, hit my head on the wood floor in my office, and I suffered a concussion. And I've been healing since then. And mentally, cognitively, I feel great. I think like the first or second podcast episode I put out, I was like mid healing the concussion and I had so much editing to do because my brain would just stop working in the middle of thinking. Now, cognitively, I'm feeling great. I'm feeling like pretty on top of my game. I'm feeling back to me, back to normal. But, physically, I suffered some really interesting things, I guess you could say, after that kind of led into what I'm healing now. And I took like a stool test, a gut test, around the same time, got a bunch of blood work back. And it turns out that I'm not anemic, but I lack ferritin and iron in my body. And I won't go into a whole biology lesson of what ferritin is, but essentially it's what gives your muscles protein or like energy so that you can function. And I had none of it. I had like 4. My level was like a 4. That's not the first time that's happened, but again, it's kind of shocking that it keeps happening and no doctor can figure out why. Well, my amazing doctor here in Denver is a functional doctor and she was like, "I think you have SIBO." And I was like, "Okay." She's like, "You might have H. pylori, but like I'm guessing if I gave you a stool test and it came back, you'd be positive for SIBO, and if I gave you a breath test, it'd be positive." And honestly, I was skeptical because I was like, I thought I had SIBO a few years ago, and this doctor told me that I didn't based on my symptoms. And she's like, "I'm telling you now, you probably do." Well, you guys, my tests came back and I tested from 0 to 10 is the scale that they give you. My inflammation is a 6 out of 10, but the inflammation is being fed by dysbiosis or an imbalance in my gut and most likely pointing to SIBO. The rating was 10 out of 10. So I'm happy I have a response. Like I'm happy that I have something to like show me where to go in the right direction. But it was pretty scary to like really sink in the fact that I have not been able to experience optimal health for a very long time due to dysbiosis or imbalance, bacterial overgrowth in the gut. And of course, what's going through my head is how long has this been here? How long have I been suffering from this? Am I just now realizing it because the symptoms are getting worse? Like I was reading that people can have SIBO and not even know. And so my gut tells me that I just need a few months of healing and I'll be okay. But of course, like getting in my head, I'm like, oh my gosh, like this is actually a little bit scary. So I'm kind of holding space for both truths to be true at the same time. But I'm here and I've been doing celery juice every single morning except for the week of my period for the last 3 weeks, or I guess the last month technically, nothing can get digested or like absorbed in my gut. So everything has to be either through an IV or under my tongue. I am doing it all. I'm literally doing it all. But yeah, so I'm just navigating this like as best as I can every single week. I've been reading a lot that SIBO is actually a symptom of low acid in the stomach. So I've been trying to eat more foods like fermented foods that help produce stomach acid in the gut. But again, I have yet to meet with my doctor. This has been all me kind of figuring this out on my own because my doctor is so incredible that she literally has a wait list for her own patients, which is crazy. So she put me on her wait list. So hopefully there's a cancellation sooner than May 2nd. But May 2nd is when I'm supposed to get my call with her. And, I'm just the kind of person that if I know that something is not right, I'm going to do what I can to fix it. Call it the perfectionist in me. I don't know. I tend to think that it's more like the empowered version of me who knows that I can take full responsibility for my health and my life and like move towards healing. And I was talking to Tyler about it the other day, and he was like, I think that's what Family Constellation Therapy gave you. And he's right. Before I found Family Constellation Therapy, I was very much a victim in my life. I was really good at blaming, pointing fingers, and just kind of making other people responsible for things that were happening in my life. And I always felt like a victim to something, like, oh, poor me, I'm always going to suffer with this, or I'm always going to suffer with that. And Family Constellation Therapy made me realize I am not a victim in the healing space and in my emotional maturity and in my emotional evolution, my spiritual evolution. I am not a victim. Like, I was the definition, and I'd like to think I still am in some ways, of when something is wrong, you go after it and you conquer. Like, you do not let this thing become your identity. And part of that has been tapping into generational gifts from my dad's side of the family. They are very much like that. I shared on a recent podcast episode, actually the one about generational gifts, that my grandfather always said, when tough times push us back, like push us down, we come back roaring with the soul of a lion. And so I like to think that that was me with my spiritual health coming back roaring. And now I'm having to do it with my health in a really, really, really deep way, because intuitively, as I've been sitting with this whole SIBO stuff, I've really been realizing that my gut issues actually might be the core root cause of my thyroid issues, my painful periods, the continuation of the endometriosis in my body. I mean, literally everything, like down to my research of SIBO has shown that people with SIBO suffer from B12 and iron deficiencies, but they're not anemic. And that is exactly what I have. So it's crazy that no doctor has ever touched on this before with my health. And also, I feel so grateful that I found Dr. Caitlin O'Connor here in Denver. She was recommended by my acupuncturist, who I'm also incredibly grateful for. And it feels like in some weird way, I'm still trying to grow roots in Colorado, but at the same time, Colorado has been giving me everything that I've needed. And it's kind of this like unfolding magical gift that keeps happening in Colorado. So I will update you guys as soon as I know more. I would be so curious if you've suffered from SIBO and you went down the natural route, if there was something that really changed your experience with healing it, if you were able to heal it. Like, DM me on Instagram. My handle's in the show notes. I would love to hear, because honestly, I'm kind of like on my own with this thing a little bit until I get to talk to my doctor, and that's almost a month from now. So I would love to hear your experience and anything that you want to share. So that's my mini life update. But let's get into today's episode, because honestly, this topic is really sensitive to talk about. It's not one that I get into a lot, but it is one of the things that I look for first in a family constellation therapy session, alongside belonging. So I'll always look for two things in people's first constellations. Majority of the time. Sometimes the things are like really obvious, but if it's like kind of we're going in blind and a little general, I'll look for any early deaths in the family. So did anyone die under 55? And I'll explain why that's significant in a little bit. And also, how are you belonging to your family in ways that may not be in your highest and best good? Meaning, how are you trying to connect to your family, even if those things that you're connecting with them on don't feel good for you? I did an entire podcast episode about belonging in episode number 42. So if you want to go back and listen to that, I got incredible feedback from that episode, and it was honestly so fun to record. So highly recommend, if that belonging kind of sparks this resonance within you, definitely go listen to it and check it out. But as I've been on this healing journey, I've really been leaning into the medical medium and a lot of his protocols, like celery juice every single morning. For a while, I was also doing the heavy metal detox smoothie. And when I was doing that in the mornings, I was writing in my journal about the beginning of the process of the gut detox and just kind of letting my feelings out on paper as I process it. And one morning, as I was doing that, Tyler sent me this super random article from The Onion about a father in Oregon who wrote an essay talking about how in 1 month he sold his company for millions of dollars, and then like 3 weeks later, his 8-year-old son passed in his sleep from SUDEP, or sudden unexpected death in epilepsy. And honestly, the article was heartbreaking to read. I was a little bit shocked that the father was writing the article like only a few months after his son died, which is really interesting way to process it. I'll link it in the show notes if you want to read it. It is sad, but it is eye-opening in a lot of ways and very vulnerable to read. The author, the father, notes that his wife also has a blog, and she called it All That Remains. And he writes in his essay, as my wife writes in her beautiful post, All That Remains, she says, please ask us about our son's death and his life. We heal in small bits while talking about it. And for some reason, you guys, this just absolutely, it shook me to my core. I have full body chills even just reading that sentence, because I, as a family constellation therapy facilitator, understand the power of what it means to acknowledge the people's lives who we've lost too early in a beautiful way. And it really got me thinking about the beauty of keeping the role and the memory of the people who died early in our hearts, and what it means to continue their legacy, even if the way that they passed was painful. And it was painful to experience their death as we continue to live on. And I think everybody, has someone in their lives who's died early. And I think sometimes even the most profound deaths we experience in life are the ones that happen too soon and too young. I heard this really wonderful quote from an actor. I don't remember. I think his name is Andrew Garfield. He lost his mom early. And he said really beautifully that grief is the unexpressed love we wish we could give to that person. And if this podcast episode is something that you're listening to because you have also experienced an early death in your family, whether it's through a baby that you lost, a miscarriage, an abortion, a stillborn, or something more traumatic, and I'll go on to some examples in the episode, please know that your grief that comes up in this episode today is the unexpressed love you wish you could give to them. And you have every opportunity in your life every single day to express that love. It just may look and feel a little bit different than the way you wish it could look, but it doesn't take away from the intention nonetheless. So thank you for being here. Please know that I know this topic is sensitive, but as we go into this episode, I really invite you to keep an open heart and an open mind around how healing is available to you through this topic. So, in the eyes of family constellation therapy, the trauma of unhealed and unspoken about deaths in our lives blocks our ability to process emotions, truly heal, and move forward in life. So if you find that you are somebody who experienced an early death and you processed it, you grieved it, you let yourself feel all the feels, and you are now in this place where you can talk about the death and it doesn't hit you in such a painful way, or it doesn't feel like it's blocking your ability to feel and express and move forward in your life, then this episode, it may not resonate with you. But what it may do is it may help you in the journey of acknowledging the role of that person in a different way. So, holding space for a lot of things to be true for you, because it's not black and white. But if you're somebody who's experienced early death and you're like, I don't think I've ever processed my emotions around this fully, I still feel like everything I do is because I haven't worked through the grief of this. Or if you feel that that death is still lingering in your life in some way that feels negative or feels like a block, this is absolutely going to resonate with you. And as we go into this episode, when I talk about early deaths and missing people, I want you to also keep in mind that the way the trauma of early deaths can show up for you, and honestly might most likely show up for you, is around the theme of loss. So keep in mind that we are going to talk a lot about loss today through the lens of early deaths. For starters, an early death in family constellation therapy describes somebody who dies early, under 55 years old in the family system. And we will also refer to them as missing people. These are people that didn't get to live the fullness of their life, and that's why we call it an early death. We are usually talking about family members who have died and their role in the family is still unacknowledged, meaning there's this interesting thing that happens when somebody dies where the person will die early. It'll usually be from something tragic, unexpected, or traumatic. And we will almost pretend that that death didn't happen. We will almost pretend that the feelings that we have around it don't matter. And we'll just kind of get really good at compartmentalizing it, stuffing it down, and moving on with our lives. Because honestly, in some way, what else are we feeling we're supposed to do? Like, okay, well, they're gone. Now I guess like I have to move on with my life. It's in that how you move forward and how you move on that is really where the enmeshment and the stickiness comes in. I've spent countless FCTs discovering and healing early deaths in people's family systems, even small infants that really barely even got a first or a middle name. And acknowledging their importance and their role in the family is really important, even the babies, because even if the role that somebody holds in a family system is for a small or short amount of time, it still has an impact on the people around the one who died. They're forever changed. And the thing with loss is that it's not easy. It pulls at our hearts, and loss and early death can cause us to close our hearts forever out of the fear that if we were to lean into love again, we might lose it all. Love starts to become unsafe. And maybe that is the case. Maybe it does happen again. Maybe early deaths, they do happen around you or to you again. But you know the interesting thing that I find about death, and I've told this to many people before who fear death. It's like we wake up every day and we face the risk of death every day without certainty. Loss is really interesting and it's kind of funny. We try to control and manage the risk of measurable losses every day, but the truth is the chance of facing hard times is always the same every day. And we as humans get really good at telling ourselves that loss won't happen or death won't happen and that we can control our environment and we can get out of any terrible situation or outcome. But I'll be the first to tell you that when it's someone's time to go, it's their time to go. But that doesn't mean that you stop living your life. And again, that's the how you move forward that really gets sticky. It's really important in the work of FCT that we honor the place that each family member has in our lives and their role in the family. Meaning, if your mom died early, she's still your mother. She still holds the role of mother. And you still hold the role of child. If you lost a baby early and it was your first baby, that baby will always be your first baby, and they hold the role of first child. Everyone needs to be honored for the role that they hold in the family. And that's why many times during the healing statements, if you've done an FCT with me, at the end, you'll say, "Dear family member," as you're tapping on your chest, and we'll address them like, "Dear son, dear daughter, dear mother, dear father, I honor you." We're not only honoring the role that they play in our lives, we're also honoring the role that they play in the entire family system and the lineage. And the way that I'll describe this is usually like the family tree. It's like if you were to look at your family tree and a huge part of the tree was missing, the tree wouldn't be steady. The tree would fall. The tree would be lopsided. It wouldn't be that full, beautiful, big tree that we want to see with a family system. That's why so many family systems feel unstable, because everyone is out of order. Everyone is enmeshed in each other's trauma. There's missing people all over the place. There's not a lot of healing. There's not a lot of acknowledgement. and there's not a lot of order happening. Family constellation therapy works to restore order and hierarchy in the family. When I first heard that in FCT, I was like, order, fine. Hierarchy, like, don't like that word. But the thing is, you guys, is that everything in this world needs order, like even down to the spirit world. If you have read the book, The Journey of Souls by Dr. Michael Newton, who was a hypnotist in the 60s or 70s and hypnotized a bunch of people to speak to their souls about what happens when we cross over and die on the other side. Best book I've ever read. He talks about how souls, when they're hypnotized and, these humans are speaking from the soul perspective, they're saying there is order in the spirit world. There's souls, and then eventually these souls get so much experience in different planets, different dimensions, different lifetimes, that then they graduate to a guide. And the first level guide, their aura is yellow. And then the second level guide, their aura is blue. And then a master guide, their aura is white. And then there's a council of guides. And then there's ascended masters. And then there's source, right? Like there's so many different hierarchies and orders, even in the spirit world. And for some reason, that gave me a lot of like solace or peace. I was like, oh, well, if the spirit world has order, then I'll allow order and hierarchy in my family. It's just my own thing. But we really do need order, because without order, there is chaos. Most human beings in 2024, in modern day society, do not die early under 55 because of old age. That is long gone. I still think 55 is too young. I still think you could even call an early death somewhere around 65. But in the fundamentals of FCT, we'll call it 55. And at 55 or younger, you haven't lived the totality of your life, and you haven't experienced the fullness of a whole lifetime. I touched on this a bit earlier. Usually, if someone passes around or under 55, it's due to a traumatic or tragic reason. And it could be, but it's not limited to, miscarriages, abortions, a loss of a pregnancy, a stillborn, twins if one doesn't survive. That's birth related and infant related, but it can also include things like sudden traumatic death, like the SUDEP that the man was writing about in the article I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast. It could be cancer, like my aunt who died at 52 from breast cancer, and we still are grieving her death all the time. Murder, gang-related murders, car accidents. I have a crazy story about this coming up in the episode with my mentor and her grandmother's death. And even suicide, overdoses, addiction, abuse. I mean, you name it. There are so many ways that people can pass early. When I first recorded that first episode that I told you about at the beginning of this episode, and I was like, I don't like it. There's not enough spirituality in it. It's too like black or white. For me, I'll just speak for myself personally, and you may resonate with this too. When I started learning about early deaths in FCT training, I was really kind of taken back by the information, because a part of me was actually quite confused. I was like, okay, well, some people in their blueprints, in their soul contracts, like they do agree to, pass a certain way, or there's something that is far more cosmic about this than we're really seeing in just, if you die early, it's like a black hole in the family system, which I'll get to in a second. There's just this like question mark inside of me still that I'm like, okay, I can understand, if someone were to die early, how it could be like a personal choice. Like if somebody was going through cancer and they decided not to go through chemo, could their souls have gone on to live afterwards? Maybe, but that's why we have free will and personal choice when we come to the human world. Like we get to experience, whatever we want to create. So there's still a really big question mark for me in that. And I think many times when I'm dealing with early deaths in the family system, I'm constantly asking myself, okay, was this a soul path or was this unintended? Where is the trauma? Because I will say I have experienced people in FCTs where there is early death, and interestingly, the client and I both have this weird feeling like, I think it was meant to be that way. I think it was meant to happen in that way, right? I will still acknowledge the early death, and I will still acknowledge, that there may be lingering trauma from that early death that nobody's talked about. But there are other FCTs where there's like, no, this person like actively took their life too early, right? And like, I'm looking at a spectrum of different kinds of early deaths. So I just want to put that out there, that that's the complicated part about understanding the soul journey, is that we don't really always know the why. We just kind of have to look at what's happening in front of us and what's happening in the family system to see if there's still anything lingering that we need to heal. So I just want to keep that in mind for those spiritualists out there who are like, well, what if? And I'm like, yeah, I'm also that what if person. And I don't have a concrete answer for you, but when I do, I'll tell you about it. But that's what I've gathered so far, is like, you got to just kind of look at how it's affecting the family system. Be curious. You have to have like a curious eye. So what it means when someone dies early is it's that somebody doesn't have a secure role in the family system. There's no order with it, like we talked about earlier. And the whole point of acknowledging somebody's role in the family system when they've died early is to give them their rightful place, so that there isn't something we call a black hole or like a pothole in a family system. And I'll explain what this is. I like the idea of a pothole better, because a pothole is a little bit more of a tangible example that we all understand, right? Like, you're driving, your tire hits a pothole, and your car could get stuck in that pothole, right? I want you to think of family constellation therapy as a literal star constellation. And everyone in your family is a star with their own place and their own little world and their own energy. And everyone in a constellation should be shining and bright and healthy and just taking up space, right? But when you have someone who goes missing, there's literally a hole where that star should be, where that person should be. And the hard part, and this is why I like the pothole example, is that future generations will come into this constellation and they'll get pulled into what we call the black hole or the pothole, and they'll get stuck in it. And they'll usually get stuck in the trauma of what happened. So it's not like they'll be taking on the identity of that person or they'll be reincarnating as that person. It's mostly just like whatever happened around that early death. Let's just say it was a miscarriage, then future generations could come in, and not only could they experience miscarriages themselves, because there's now a pattern of that in the family system, but it's energetic and epigenetic, but it also could be that there's a theme of loss in the family system that nobody can get out of. So a black hole is really created when there's a missing person in the family system. And it's where that person should be standing in the family system. But because they died early, now it's empty and there's no one to hold that space. So what family constellation therapy will do is we will call in the soul of that person and acknowledge them, acknowledge the trauma that they went through, and acknowledge their role in the family system, so that future generations don't end up carrying that trauma and the baggage on for the family member or the system as a whole. People will fall into that hole and follow the patterns of that trauma of what happened until it's healed. So if you know that your great uncle died from addiction, and you notice that your brother has addiction and you're also addicted in some ways to certain things, maybe not drugs or alcohol, porn or food, but maybe it's like working or being busy, that like addiction energy is just, it's leaking out into the family system. The easiest example I can give around this is the story of grandma's miscarriages. This is like the classic example that I give because it's like the easiest one to understand. If your grandma had a miscarriage or multiple miscarriages and the baby's lives were never honored, and there was a lot of shame and secrets and hiding these losses and never talking about them, never acknowledging that they were her first babies, then these babies will leave a hole in the family system due to that experience, due to the trauma, due to the loss, due to the the shame of grandma's experience. And that pattern or theme of loss or shame, because grandma never took the time to grieve or process the losses, that starts lingering in the family system. And that's not just energetic, you guys. We're talking like there is serious data out there these days showing that this is truly epigenetic in our bodies as well. I'm actually going to link one of my favorite TED Talks about epigenetics by a researcher named Moses Sisyph. I'll link it in the show notes for you to watch. It's 15 minutes, but it's fascinating because it will show you how emotional traits get passed down, not just physical ones. So the interesting thing is that these next generations of grandma might actually suffer from a deep fear of losing their children or losing their partners or their jobs or like the loss of anything. And the pattern will show up as a fear because it's unhealed. So You know that great Brene Brown quote where she says, you need to feel it to heal it? In fact, I don't even know if she coined that, but that's where I learned it from. You have to feel it to heal it. You've got to name it to be able to move through it. Like the only way to get on the other side of it is to go through it. And that's what we're talking about in the how. Remember I mentioned that how, the how we move forward from grief, how we move forward from early death. It's in the how where things get stuck. And I'm going to keep saying that until it feels really solid for you, because it is in the how you move forward that really is the make or break factor for the trauma continuing in the family. Sometimes we never know if there is early death in the family right away. Sometimes people will come to me and they'll be like, I don't know if there's early death in my family system. And I'm like, okay, that's great. Like, you can always talk to your family if you're in good relationship with them. You can always ask them about it. You can ask questions. But what's really interesting, the most fascinating part of early deaths with FCT is usually how it shows up on the papers. So if you're not familiar with what a session is like, the short of the long of it is I open up an energy field in the session and I have you stand on pieces of paper that could represent people's, places, things, chakras, ideas, words. When you're on these papers, if there is an early death, it will show up very clearly. Sometimes it happens when we know that there's an early death in the system, and sometimes it's unexpected. But what your body does on the papers will show me a lot about what's stuck in the family system. But the fascinating part that I was touching on is that people will stand on a piece of paper, and what shows me early death is immediately they will want to either lay down on the floor, drop to the ground, or make a teapot shape with their body. So like they'll kind of lean down to the left or lean down to the right with one side of their body. And that is what we call in FCT following the dead, which sounds terrifying, but I promise it's not. It's actually really fascinating. But it's oftentimes this magnetic or energetic pull to be close to the ground, close to the earth. And that usually means someone's buried, someone has died, and the client might be following the dead, or whatever paper the client is standing on is also following the dead, meaning the client could be standing on mom's paper. And because they're standing on mom's paper, they're embodying the energetics of mom. And so if mom gets pulled down to the ground, there's an early death with mom that she hasn't healed, either with her or in her lineage. And that sparks a ton of questions like, was there a miscarriage, a stillborn, an abortion? Did anyone die early? Was she a twin? Like, I got to ask all these different questions. Okay, so I'm going to share with you guys a fascinating fact about FCT and give you a really interesting story about this. So when I was learning about early deaths, we were looking at a lot of our own families, right? Like the nuclear family, the extended family, but only within one family system. In FCT, we learned that if somebody else from a different family system comes to impact the life and the death of somebody in another family system, those two families are now enmeshed due to trauma. I'm going to give you a fascinating story. Some of you, this may be like an aha, oh my God moment. My mentor, Carrie, who taught me and introduced me to FCT, her grandmother died at the hands of a drunk driver. And she said that when she was getting into FCT, her facilitator told her that the drunk driver was now a part of the family system permanently in some way because he affected the life of her grandmother. So that blew my mind, because there are certain things that happen where other people impact our family story and it's outside of our family system. And that enmeshment, again, you guys got to think about it like if two branches from separate trees were to grow into each other, like they're enmeshed. If there was like leaky energy, right? Like, and it's now leaking outside of the family system. Like that's what we're talking about. Energetic boundaries within a family system are incredibly important because not only does it protect the family, but it protects you from taking on other things and other family systems that are not yours to carry. And this is where we get into like the niche stuff. Okay. Like, I don't want you to start spiraling in your head being like, oh my God, what if this? What if that? I could go down a whole rabbit hole of soulic DNA and ancestral DNA. I mean, basically all you need to know is that if you feel that there is somebody that affect the life and the death of somebody in your family system, bring it to an FCT with me and we can give you healing. We can give you freedom, and we can give that family member freedom too. So in light of all that this is, because I know this is a heavy topic, I know that this can really get the brain going, right? I want you to know that people can go missing and die early, and we can bring them back into the family system. Like, we can put our missing family members back in their rightful role in the family system despite their traumatic death, just by acknowledging them, by speaking to them. And if we are carrying trauma for them, giving back the trauma that we aren't meant to carry, because in some ways we took it on out of love because we thought that's what we were supposed to do. And later in this episode, I'll give you some of my favorite ways to honor your loved ones that have died early and their role in the family system, so you don't feel like you're leaving the episode empty-handed with no tools. So I have a personal story about an early death in my family that I will share with you. And it's really interesting because this early death happened in a really traumatic way in phases. So basically, my dad is the youngest of 5, and his oldest brother, Antoine, which is the French name for Anthony, died when he was 9 years old. There's a really interesting family story with this. My grandmother's name was Mary or Marie, and my grandfather's name is Joseph. And they had their first son born on Christmas Eve. Kind of crazy story. My family's very religious, so we read into that stuff, but I think it's beautiful. Beautiful symbolism, if anything. I'm not saying my uncle's Jesus. I'm just saying the symbolism is beautiful. When my uncle Antoine was born, well, he was healthy in the womb, first of all. Their first child healthy in the womb. This is in Lebanon in like the 1930s or 40s. In the birth process, he got stuck in my grandmother and she couldn't push him out. And so the doctor ended up using metal forceps to pull him out of the womb, out of the birthing canal. And in that process, mentally deformed his head, which led to mental illness and physical deformities that he suffered from his entire life. And he basically lived with my family for a very short amount of time. And then they sent him off to a nunnery to live with nuns to take care of him because it was such a burden to carry. He lived in a nunnery until he was 9 years old. My grandparents would go meet him. My grandparents ended up having actually, you know what? I think my dad was born, or my dad had either just been born or was about to be born when my uncle Antoine passed. And it was this huge grief, right? Like, imagine you have your first child, you know your child's healthy, and then at the hands of this doctor, so another person in a different family system, affects the life and the death of a family member in another family system. I can't even imagine. My dad told me a story where my grandfather, my jiddo, which is grandpa in Lebanese, he had this plan to basically like go confront the doctor and, just give it to him. And my dad said that my grandpa went to church and he had this moment where he realized like, this is not in my hands, but I can't even imagine the anger, the shame, the frustration, the guilt, not only that my grandparents felt, but this doctor. Like, I can't even imagine. I have yet to do an FCT on this, partly because it doesn't feel like it's time. It actually feels like it'll be time when I get pregnant or like when I become a mother one day, and I'll explain why. When I was born, I am the oldest of 5 children, okay? I was in the same role as Antoine, my uncle. And when I was born, I got stuck in the birth canal in the birthing process, and my mom couldn't push me out. And luckily, due to the fact that my dad had this experience with his brother, and actually my mom, the oldest and only child of her family, got stuck in her mom too and almost died. So I've got trauma from both sides of the family with being the oldest and being born. Luckily, because they went through those experiences, my parents were like, no. Like, you don't touch her head. You just figure out another way. So I was born via C-section. I am so grateful to my parents to this day for the absolute protection and love. They spared my life because of their protection and their love in that case. But, when I learned about that story, I was a lot older and I hadn't really known about who my uncle Antoine was at that time. But when I was probably like 10 years old and I heard about my uncle Antoine dying at 9 and the birthing stuff, and then I realized that I had that too, I felt this like crazy connection to him after that. I was like, oh, I want to see more pictures of him. I want to hear more stories about him, because I was really drawn to this uncle that I never had technically. And I didn't ask a lot of questions about him growing up. My dad had this photo of him in his office, but whenever people would talk about him in my family, it was almost like they were kind of pitting him, or like they felt like a deep sadness that you could feel. And it was hard for me to talk about as well because my dad was the youngest of five. My dad was barely born or a baby when he died. The kids didn't really have a remembering in detail about him per se. And I never dared brought it up to my grandparents because I did not want to cause any sadness or pain or tears. And we didn't really have that kind of relationship either. I just kind of accepted that I had this uncle that I never knew, but I really, really, really wanted to know him. So when my mentor first started FCT with me, she identified this early death like early on. She was like, okay. And it was within the first 5 FCTs that we addressed him specifically. I will never forget one of the most memorable FCTs I've ever done was about my uncle Antoine. And what was interesting is the morning of that FCT, I was automatic channeling, journaling, and I was burning sage and talking to spirit. And this was like my real spiritual awakening, like 3 years ago. I remember feeling, because I can feel spirits and feel energy pretty tangibly. And so I remember feeling the energy of this dog or little boy or like playful spirit was just around me. And I remember thinking, oh, that's interesting. It feels like a dog's energy, but it's not a dog. It's like I couldn't really figure out what it was. I was so new to this stuff at the time. I get on the paper that represented loss, the war in Lebanon, and early deaths in the field. And I felt behind me a small boy. It freaked me out at first because right in the beginning of my big awakening, I was learning to communicate with spirit, and I had never communicated with a child presence before. It was really, really interesting. And I remember standing on that paper and thinking, oh my God, I felt like there was a dog energy around me this morning, but now I'm realizing it's a little boy. It's that same young, playful, innocent energy that a dog has, that a little boy has as well. And so when Carrie saw me going through this on the paper, she was like, okay, what are you feeling? What do you see? Like, explain to me. And I was like, I see a little boy dressed up in like 1930s, 1940s outfit, a paperboy hat, suspenders, socks up to the knees. And it was exactly how Antoine would have been dressed at 9 years old when he passed. To be honest with you, it was so scary for me to experience this energy because Antoine was literally standing right behind me that I just couldn't get out of the experience. So Carrie had to ground me, and she was like, to validate basically my experience, she said, right before you brought up that you felt your uncle, I wrote down uncle and I underlined it. And I was like, oh my God, Antoine was there. And we were addressing his early death, and nobody had addressed it like this before. And there was still pain and loss and suffering in the family. And he was showing up for the healing that I was participating in. And once I could get through the initial shock and kind of the freakiness or the creepiness of the energy, I realized that he was coming to say thank you. And I realized that he was there because his soul needed to feel that experience. And a part of me felt like he had been waiting for me to do that for a long time. After that experience, I didn't really feel him much. He did come up in a Kundalini energy session I was doing last year in the summer. And in my mind's eye, I felt and saw a boy standing in the corner, very slim, didn't look like Antoine, but it felt like him. He was wearing a t-shirt and shorts, and I had an overwhelming feeling that this was my son, but it also felt like Antoine's energy. I don't know how. Because I had that experience with him, I just kind of knew that's what his energy feels like. Everyone's energy kind of has a certain imprint in it. And what was interesting is a week later, I actually did an FCT with my friend Julie on the war in Lebanon again, and its connection to my OCD thoughts and intrusive thoughts I was having. And at the end of the session, she said, I think that Antoine might come back into your family again. And I think he's trying to decide if he's going to come back as your son. And I have full body chills when I say that because I just feel like, yes, like I wouldn't be surprised if he did, because I knew that there was something in the healing that I did that showed Antoine that he does have a role in our family system, and that it's safe and okay for him to come back into the family and to have the childhood that he's ready to have. And it could be as my son one day. And I thought that was really beautiful. So that's my personal story with it. And I have done a little bit of work on my birth trauma, but again, it's always felt like I needed to address Antoine first, and then as I get closer to motherhood in the next few years, I know that it'll be this knowing that comes down as like this cosmic download, and I'll be like, it's time to go into the birth trauma. What I don't want to do, and this is where the role of being a cycle breaker comes in, okay? If I know that there's trauma in my family system around the eldest children almost dying in birth, or being close to death in birth, or experiencing traumatic birth, if that was my mom's story, if that was my oldest uncle's story, and if that was my story, then guess what, guys? I have the opportunity to heal that trauma in the family system. I just have to know when it's time. And when it will be time is when it's time for me to become a mother, because what I don't want to do is pass that trauma on to my kids. And I do not want to go through a traumatic birth. And I know my child doesn't either. So this is where we have opportunities to become cycle breakers, is seeing how trauma has been passed down and then choosing to do things differently, not out of anger or angst with our families, not out of, well, fuck them, I'm going to do it differently, but because we know we have the power to do it differently. And that power is love. Love for myself, love for my body, and love for my children, and love for my family. So nothing can prepare us for the loss of a human being in our life, whether it's in the womb, something happens in the womb, or something happens outside. A human being represents the flesh and blood of a soul coming into the reality of the world that we live in. Being a human being means grounding into the root. It means grounding into the earth. It solidifies the idea that someone else is going to or does already play a role in our lives. And when that role is stripped away due to trauma, it can shatter our perception of life, of love, of relationships, of birth, of the ability to be present in our lives, the ability to experience joy. I can promise you with every single bone in my body that when spirits cross over, whether they're stuck in the middle world or whether they fully go through the light, they are at peace. They do experience a level of peace, and we don't have to live in their trauma. So we have to give them the ability to be free from that, and we have to do that for ourselves too. The quickest way to clear energy with all of this is just to honor the missing person. And again, I'll give you a few ways as to how. So here are my favorite ways to honor your family members who have died early, even if you didn't know them. The first one is a very simple one. It's prayer and meditation. You can set aside time for prayer and meditation to connect with your deceased family members on a spiritual level. You can sit in meditation and connect to their energy, even if you don't consider yourself spiritual. You can just think of them in your mind and think of what they looked like and your memories together and the memories you have of them and the stories you've heard of them. And you can pray and set the intention for healing for them, for their peace, for their well-being in the afterlife. And you can meditate to feel presence with them, to feel their presence around, and to get their guidance. And this can be done individually. You can do this by yourself, or you can do this in your family if they're open to it, or in a group activity. So don't forget the power of intention, okay? If you set the intention in your heart that you want to focus on the love and the peace and the well-being of somebody in the afterlife, know that that is the telepathic way that your family member is going to feel your presence and feel you calling to them, and they will absolutely answer that call. Seriously, it's really beautiful. I've experienced it many, many times, and they will literally just like pop up. They will literally pop. There are so many moments, you guys, where I'm sitting in bed or I'm in my office and I'm like thinking about what would my Jindo do? What would my Teta, my grandmother do? What would they do? What would they say? How would they feel about this? Kind of looking for their approval, their guidance or something. Like literally so many times, not every time, but so many times I will literally feel them next to me, in front of me, in the corner. And I'll be like, all right, thanks guys. Like, what do I do now? And, being actively using my intuition and using my clairaudience, clairsentience, clairvoyance, all these things, I'm able to communicate with them, but you don't have to do all of these fancy things to connect with them, because we all have hearts. And in our heart is this compass, this antenna, this energetic communicator that we all have, that we can feel into at any time. And if I'm being quite honest, whenever I'm sensing, knowing, hearing, feeling things from an energy or a soul, it's filtering through the heart. I'm not asking my brain if it makes sense. I'm sensing all these things and then I'm feeling it through my heart, which is why so many times when I do readings for people or I do mediumship or even an FCT, I will start crying because the feeling in my heart that I'm getting, that your ancestor is giving me, is so profound and so beautiful. I can't think my way through it. I'm literally feeling it. And I have a heart. You have a heart. Everyone here listening has a heart, okay? We all have one. So this is our energetic antenna, our compass. This is our communicator. Don't forget that, okay? Whenever you feel that you want to tap into an ancestor, you tap into your heart. If you want to connect with an energy on something, you tap into your heart. This is why you hear so many spiritual teachers saying, love is the only way. Your heart is your guide. Let your heart be your guide, right? I think that's like in a Disney movie or something. There's a reason for that. So lean into that, trust it. The second thing you can do comes from religious practices that I grew up in around the Catholic Church, but I still think it has a beautiful symbolism, and it's lighting a candle or incense. So when you light a candle or you burn incense in remembrance of your loved ones, it can symbolize the light and the warmth of their spirit, and it can evoke memories and a sense of their presence. And you can do this at any time. So let me grab something real quick. So a couple of years ago, Tyler and I went to go visit his family for the holidays, and we went to get Blue Bottle coffee in the morning just to get out of the house. And Tyler loves his Blue Bottle coffee. So we went to go get it in Los Gatos near San Jose. And we walk into Blue Bottle, and I don't drink coffee. So I am there for, just spending time with him, quality time. And I always peruse the accessories, and I'm just like a toucher feeler. I'm like, oh, this is cute. That's cute. I find this candle, and it says an origin candle, and it's like Blue Bottle by something, Candles New York or something like that. And I grab it and I smell it. You guys, this is literally my grandfather's cologne. He used to wear Polo Ralph Lauren cologne, the green label. And, I could go and buy the cologne, but I don't, because honestly, it would just sit here. Like I would spray it here and there, but I like to actually experience it like randomly. Like I'll literally be walking at the mall. I'll walk past like an older gentleman. He's wearing the cologne and I'm like, thanks, Shado. I like moments like that more than like forcing it, like buying the cologne and smelling it. So this was one of those moments. And even when I smell it now, you guys, I literally just like get emotional. I feel like all my energy just like lifts, like my vibration lifts. And I'm just like happy. I'm happy to experience this scent. And I can just smell my Jado spirit. It feels like I'm calling to him. And I have burned it a little bit, if you can see on video. And I burned it in moments where I really needed it. I burned it in moments where I was really struggling and I needed to feel that he was with me in his memory and his energy. And I've even burned it during the ancestral subconscious meditation that I do on Zoom in the groups. And I don't plan on burning it anymore. And I wish I could buy another one. I think they like discontinued it, but I'll always keep this in memory of him because it just reminds me so much of him and his spirit. And I need his guidance and his wisdom a lot. And I really do feel him when he's around. Another thing that you can do is to create an ancestral altar or like a shrine of some kind, basically like dedicating a table or like a bookcase, if you can see behind me, like a small area in your home where you can put things that honor your family members and remember your deceased family members. If you suffered from a miscarriage or you got an abortion or you had a stillborn, like put something that you were wearing the day that you found out you were pregnant, or the sonogram photo. You really want to like decorate it with photos and candles or flowers or other meaningful objects that remind you of them, because again, just like my candle, it evokes this emotional feeling of processing in a healthy and loving way. You're not stuffing things down. This is why ofrendas in the Latin culture, Dia de los Muertos, are so, so beautiful and important because it offers the memory and the spirit of our loved ones, especially if they've died early, and you can talk to them. That's another one too, is talk to them. It doesn't have to be in prayer or meditation. Just talk to them. Talk to them when you're in the car driving. Talk to them when you're, on a walk. just speak to them, because you guys on the other side, they can still hear us. You know what's so interesting is I follow this woman on TikTok. I'll link her in the show notes as well. She does like readings on TikTok, and she'll do peeks at celebrities who have crossed over and see what their souls are doing on the other side. And I'm so fascinated by this. And she said that when she has been doing all these readings over the years, that spirit has always told her, we can cross over and come visit you guys on earth in energy form, but people usually actually come visit us more often than not, meaning our energies, our psyches, our souls, we try to go visit them more than they try to come visit us. So just remember that. The last thing is to participate in kind of a ceremony. And this is, you could do this with an ofrenda or like an ancestral altar. You could do it with lighting a candle or in prayer and meditation. But it could just be that you every year have a memorial for that deceased family member, the one who died early, and you acknowledge the beautiful things about them, whether they were an infant baby that never came into full form, or whether it was someone like my aunt who passed at 52 from breast cancer. Every single year on her birthday, in the memorial of her passing, I look at photos of her and I talk to her. You know, you could hold a little dinner and make your favorite foods that they used to make. Like, you can really keep the memory alive and speak to them in any way, but just honoring them and their role, you know, it really keeps that black hole in the family system filled with their spirit and their love and their light. So what are the benefits of healing early deaths in your family? Like, what would it mean for you, if you're listening, to acknowledge the early death and that person's role in your family, whether it's, like I keep saying, from baby or adulthood? The biggest benefit that you get is resolution for yourself. And it could be resolution in the way that you're processing the trauma and what happened, or it could be resolution around the way that you're carrying the trauma in that early death. And the obvious way to do that, I mean, I didn't mention this earlier, but family constellation therapy, that's a great way to honor your ancestors. It's very, very powerful and very transformative. So really, you know, I think just resolution and peace are benefits that you get, because if you are carrying their trauma, then you get the freedom from not carrying it anymore. And the way that you may be carrying it could be through a fear, a pattern, a behavior, a way of thinking, a pattern of choices, whatever it is. But that resolution can come in the smallest and the most profound ways, just by even the way that you're faced with a trigger, or the way that you make a choice, or the way that you go about deciding something for your life. I think that resolution is also a word that spirit loves to use whenever I'm doing mediumship. A lot of times family members will come through and they'll say, I'm here for resolution. I'm here for resolution. Many times I think also guides are telling them. I get the sense that a lot of family members that come and see me that have crossed over, they're being accompanied by their guides, I think, for protection and boundaries. I think a lot of souls that have crossed over and that are coming through in mediumship are newer souls that are like, oh my God, I had no clue that this was going on. Because when souls show up with a guide, I always feel like it's their caretaker or like their babysitter, but like for guidance. But then when spirits show up by themselves, they're like, yeah, I've been doing this for a while. But they always show me the word resolution, always. Like, that word always comes up. So I think that resolution is not just for them, but it's for you as well. You know, the fact that they're like, hey, whoops, didn't make the greatest choices in that lifetime. And now I'm really understanding that it didn't just affect me, it affected 100 other people. And I need resolution, and I need to help you get the resolution so that we don't have to be stuck in this anymore. The other side is an interesting place. The more I learn about it, the more I go over there and experience it, the more I communicate with spirit, the more I'm like, wow, we literally are just like existing as we are here in a less 3D tangible form on the other side. Like, it is not what religion has painted, that like once you get to heaven, these gates open and you're like, oh, everything is healed. It's like, no, you just like exist in a different dimension in an energetic form, and it's not so 3D and so tangible on the other side. It's just fascinating. And the obvious one, but I think the most profound benefit, is the ability just to move forward in life. And I talk about that so much with FCT because this is such a huge part of what we are doing for you. It's not just for your ancestors. I mean, our focus is you. Your ancestors benefit from the work that you're doing on yourself. It ripples out into the family system. So when you do this kind of healing, you are bravely standing at the front of your lineage and you're like, hey, all of this, it's done. Like, I am done. It ends with me. I'm not suffering from this stuff anymore. It's such a Joan of Arc moment of transformation and courage, which is why I work so heavily with Joan of Arc in my work, because she is such a badass. Her energy is incredible. When you do that, though, when you say, I'm going to put in the work to end these cycles, you benefit tremendously just by being able to have all the things you desire. You become powerful. You become powerful in a loving way, and you get to move forward without all the trauma that you've been carrying that's weighing you down. You get to take steps forward towards the future and what you, the client, want. That love and that power and that trauma that you're putting down, all of the benefits of that ripple out into the family system because you're so powerful. And that is the power of a cycle breaker. Speaking of power, there is so much power in just acknowledging, saying out loud what happened, how it affected the family system, how it affected you. Speaking to that family member who's crossed over, or even speaking to your family members as you're healing on this journey is really profound. Having the difficult conversation. If you can do that and you can trust the process, and more importantly, trust what happens in the quantum field while you're on the papers, you can do some incredible, powerful healing and receive miracles in your life. I didn't get into this work because I read about it in a book and I thought it was cool. I didn't watch it on Goop. I was at rock bottom for like the third time in my life. And I was like, I don't see the point in living anymore. I am depressed. I'm anxious. I'm sick. I'm unworthy, unlovable. I'm carrying shame. I am literally living under the world's largest boulder and I'm never going to get out. And then I found FCT by accident, a recommendation from somebody who's like, I know you're looking for a life coach, but I don't know anyone, but this might be the next best thing. You guys, my first FCT was like unzipping. It's like I took that boulder and I Herculesed it out into the universe. And I was like, holy shit, what the fuck? I have been living in a very deep, dark hole for a long time, because I was able to release the things that were not mine. And it was that powerful enough that by the second session I did, I told my mentor, you need to teach me how to do this because I think I just realized what my purpose is. That's how powerful this stuff is. And there is purpose hiding behind the trauma that you're carrying for your family. It's there. It's just hiding a little bit. We got to help you find it. And part of the trauma could be an early death. You never know how trauma is going to get passed down. We just have to bring a curious eye. That's all. And that's what FCT does. So, big topic this week, early deaths. We went into a lot of different topics with the early deaths. As always, guys, take what resonates and leave the rest. Thanks for joining me on another week on the podcast. Don't forget, you guys, if you rate, subscribe, and review this podcast, screenshot your review and the fact that you rated and subscribed it and send it to me on Instagram or email me. I will put your name in a list of people to give away a free FCT. So if you're like listening to this and you're like, actually, I know that there's an early death in my family system, I would love to win a free FCT to see what's going on. Screenshot it, send it to me on Instagram. I'll put your name in the list in the mix of people in hoping to win a free family constellation therapy session. Okay? Don't forget to do that. I'm going to announce it at the end of April. It'll be big. I've got a handful of people on the list already. So put your name on the list too if this episode resonated with you. All right, guys. Thanks so much for joining. I will see you next week. Sending you lots of love.